Good morning, everyone. My name is Cindy Arnson, a little breathless from running upstairs. It is my pleasure to welcome you this morning together on behalf of the Wilson Center and also the Seattle International Foundation for what we plan on turning into an annual conference on security, migration, and the rule of law in Central America. Today's very timely discussion takes place against three very important backdrops. First, there are record numbers of Central Americans that have arrived at the U.S. border this year, seeking respite from a variety of things, including violence and crushing poverty in their home countries. Second, in Central America itself, and particularly the Northern Triangle, political leaders have a mixed record in addressing issues of corruption and rule of law that, together with gang violence and lack of economic opportunity, convince tens of thousands of people to undertake the dangerous journey in an attempt to reach the United States. And third, in our own country, immigration has become one of, if not the most polarizing issue among political leaders and the public in the United States in our time. The policies of family separation, the reduction of previously approved aid for countries of the Northern Triangle, and demands for the funding of a border wall flood the airwaves every day, at times shocking our conscience and seemingly becoming a source of intractable division. Our purpose in today's conference is to hear from those in Central America who are attempting to make a difference in their own countries and to propose solutions not only for the countries of the Northern Triangle, but also for Washington. I'd now like to invite my friend and colleague, Arturo Aguilar, who is the director of the Seattle International Foundation, to also make remarks. Arturo is a longtime internationally renowned human rights defender. He worked for the CICIG, the Commission Against Impunity in Guatemala, serving as a senior political officer to Commissioner Ivan Velázquez. Previous to that, he worked for Guatemala's first Attorney General, Claudia Paz y Paz, and he was instrumental in earlier years, and one of the most emblematic assassinations of the many in Guatemala was instrumental in solving the murder of Bishop Gerardi, who was the leader of the Archdiocese Truth Commission. So without further ado, thank you. I'd also like to recognize my colleague, Eric Olson, a consultant and a global fellow with the Latin American program, and now the director of the Seattle Foundation's advocacy platform, for all of the work that he has done in putting this together. I'd like to thank my colleagues in the Latin American program, Catalina Casas and Anders Beal, for their work, and we have a small army of interns helping out, and I don't see them now in the room, but I'm sure they will be here. There we go. Hi, tweeting and taking copious notes. So please join me in welcoming Arturo. Thank you.
Good morning, and thank you for being here, coming out early, and thank you, Cynthia. And as we say in the foundation, I'm going to use our official language, which is Spanglish, and doing some Spanish because we're talking about Central America, right? So I think that comes in handy. I want to thank Cindy and, of course, Eric and the Woodrow Wilson Center for partnering with us and having a lot of topics in common and being timely in putting together this event and talking about these three topics, which are, of course, correlated and which are, of course, in the center of the discussion in Central America and in Washington, D.C., and which are going to be, in my analysis, the center of the discussion this year and your election year next year. It's going to be intense, and my guess is not going to be pretty. and it's not gonna be pretty for us as Central Americans too. That we live in a region that is influenced by U.S. policy, and in which the future of a lot of fellow Central Americans is decided in this city, right? Us as a foundation, we are really interested in working and strengthening the rule of law in Central America and good governance in Central America, because we believe that that is the turning point, the key point in making changes in how government works in Central America and how the development agenda is built in Central America. Corruption erodes democracy, erodes the trust that citizens have in democracy, but also it shifts the agenda from a public one and a public interest one, a national agenda, to a sectorial agenda. And that doesn't enable our governments to present the citizens and, of course, the international community that helps our states with a truly sustainable and smart plan to come up with the solutions for the drivers of migration. So, for example, people need to find solutions to housing, need to find solutions to health issues and the health public system issues in Central America, and of course, two other things. One, security. People need to find safe ways to live in Central America, and the states need to provide these safe ways to live in Central America, in the rural areas and of course in the urban areas. And of course, people need jobs to survive, to make a decent and dignified livelihood. So in two words, people need to find hope again in order to be able to stay in our countries. You can build a wall. You cannot build a wall high enough or long enough, or you can put as many soldiers as you want in a border. People will find a way to go through them. You need to work on the countries. And that's what the foundation thinks. If we can partner in order to find solutions for the drivers that are just key developmental points in Central America, housing, health, education, jobs, and security, then you make a difference. If you can, we can find together a way to give hope to Central Americans for us to be willing and happy to stay in our country, I think that's the way to go. So I think these discussions on how to strengthen rule of law, how to find new ways to make a new law-abiding culture subside and be sustainable in Central America, that's the way to go to find new and more human rights respectful solutions. So thank you for being here.
Thank you all very much. Thank you to Cindy Arntzen and Arturo Aguilar for your kind words and for your opening remarks that set a good context for our discussion today. There's a biblical phrase that says you can't serve two masters. So I like to think of Cindy and Arturo as not as masters, but colleagues and friends. And so even though I work with both of you, I'm delighted that I'm not serving two masters, but working with you. So thank you all very much. Let's see. Oh, my glasses are here. As you know, the Northern Triangle of Central America has become synonymous with homicides. The region has been identified in many ways as the most deadly area in the world not at war. First Honduras and then El Salvador posted the world's highest homicide rates. In Honduras, it got to 89 per 100,000 at one point, and in El Salvador, it even got up to 103 per 100,000. San Pedro Sula in the north of Honduras got the distinction, I guess you could say, of being the deadliest city in the world for 2 years in a row. The truth is, however, that more recent information about homicides in the three countries show that numbers have begun to come down. Even though homicides have come down, though, they still remain 2 or 3 times higher than the regional average and the regional average is roughly 20 per 100,000. And in Honduras, you have a homicide rate now of 40 per 100,000, down significantly, obviously, from the 89. And in El Salvador, roughly 60 per 100,000, also down, but still 3 times higher than the regional average. And both Honduras and Guatemala have shown signs of an upward trend, unfortunately. Furthermore, we know that even if numbers decline, fear remains and has become a powerful factor in Central Americans' decision to leave their country. While the reduction in homicide rates is welcome news, there are still many questions about what is driving homicides in the Northern Triangle. It is widely assumed that they're caused by drug trafficking and drug traffickers, but is there data to back up this assumption? What percentage is caused by drug trafficking? What role do gangs play? Common crime, domestic violence and violence against women, violence perpetuated by the state. We have lots of questions. So while it's fair to say that many Central Americans are fleeing violence and homicides in their homeland, it's more challenging to explain what is causing this epidemic in homicides, and then to decide how governments should best approach this problem. That's the challenge of our first panel this morning. We're delighted to have with us some real experts in the field on this issue of homicides and violence reduction. When we started this process, I decided to reach out to good friends at Estado de la Región, based in Costa Rica. If you don't know Estado de la Región, you really need to learn about them. They do some of the best data-driven work on various issues in Central America: education, healthcare, a variety of issues, including crime and violence. And we asked them to do a specific, narrow look at homicide data in the region and what we could learn about homicides with that kind of perspective. So I'm delighted today to welcome Mario Herrera Rodriguez from Estado de la Región. He's a senior researcher there. He has conducted research on democracy, the administration of justice, and criminality in Central America for many years. He was the lead author of our report, and that report is available online, and we had a few printed copies out there, but the report is called Homicides in Central America: Toward a Better Understanding of the Trends, Causes, and Territorial Dynamics. Mario Herrera holds a degree in political science and a degree in economics from Universidad de Costa Rica. He has also worked as a professor at the School of Political Science of the Universidad de Costa Rica. So we welcome Mario, and we will ask him to make the presentation about his paper and the findings. And then we're going to hear from 2 other commentators who are also experts. We're delighted to welcome back to the Woodrow Wilson Center Laura Chioda is a senior economist in the Chief Economist's Office of the Latin America and Caribbean region and in the Office of the Chief Economist for Equitable Growth. We had her here, I think 2 years ago, maybe not that long ago.
No, it was last time, February.
That's last February.
Not this past February, yeah.
She did a marvelous report with other colleagues, not just her, but
no, it was just me.
Just
nearly
you?
killed me. Yeah.
I thought there was a list of other authors. Well, excuse me. She came here and presented it. It's called "Stop the Violence." There's a subtitle, and I'm forgetting it at the moment. But anyway, she had a couple of editions out on the table. It's on the website, but really a profound and interesting look at prevention of homicides in the region. And so we're delighted to have her here today. And then lastly, Eric Alda who is a project director at Creative Associates International working on Central America. He has extensive experience in covering crime and violence, citizen security, and development issues in the region. ALDA's main interest lies in examining crime and security in different countries, contexts in Latin America and Africa, the drivers and obstacles to institutional performance in developing countries, and how to improve the efficiency of criminal justice organizations. And this is also key to this whole description. How do states respond to the challenges of homicides? So that's our lineup. I'm going to turn it first to Mario. He has a presentation, I believe. Mario, if you want to speak from here, podium or there, whatever feels comfortable to you.
How can I change the slides?
We have the clicker.
It's over there.
Okay.
It's on the podium.
I
Here.
can go there.
Yeah, why don't you come over here? Just because they better sight line. Also, just so you know, we have two terrific interpreters today. So Mario is going to speak in Spanish. If you need translation, please raise your hand and we can bring you a, what do they call it, transponder and headphones, and so you can benefit from this. So please go ahead, Mario. Adelante.
Well, good morning. First, I want to say thank you to the Wilson Center and to the Seattle International Foundation for hosting this important activity. Here. To start, I want to point out some key facts about our research. Our main objective was to characterize the territorial patterns of high and low homicidal violence in Central America. We are interested both in the temporal variables, this is why we speak of evolution, as well as in the territorial variables, in the spatial variables. But in addition, we wanted to explore some possible explanatory factors that help explain those territorial trends. Of course, this was just a first step towards a better understanding of this subject. We used mainly interviews to explore these possible explanatory factors, and we conducted in-depth interviews in each of the countries. At first, we wanted to explore the entire region, the entire Central American region. Unfortunately, it was not possible for us to get the data from Nicaragua. Since approximately 2016, Nicaragua has had like a policy of closed institutions, not only in this topic, in many topics. It has been very difficult for us to find the necessary data. And we contacted many institutions, many experts, and it was just not possible, so we had to leave Nicaragua aside. But apart from that, fortunately, we could include all other countries. And finally, we studied the time span between 2010 and 2017. And again, this was the years for which we could find the best data, especially data at the subnational level, which is our main focus. Now I wanted to give you a general view of the homicide rates in the region. Here I plotted the homicide rates per 100,000 inhabitants. And the most important thing here to note is that the region has two realities. First, we have the Northern Triangle, Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala. And these three countries, well, as you probably know, have had during the last 17 years or more homicide rates above 30. And even in recent years, El Salvador and Honduras have had rates even above 60. And the other reality is the one from Panama and Costa Rica. And here we see rates that have fluctuated around 10. Panama has had some years where it has had rates even around 20. But nowadays, those two countries pretty much stay around 10 homicides per 100,000 inhabitants. But it's very important to note that these are national averages, and like all averages, they hide variability. And specifically, here we want to emphasize that they hide variability at the subnational level. So to better explain this, this graph shows the number of municipalities according to different homicide rate levels. The blue bars, I hope you see it as blue, are all the municipalities in each country that have homicide rates below 10. So we kind of think of these places as Pacific ones. And the orange bars are places that have more than 10 homicides per 100,000 inhabitants. So it's very interesting, for example, to see that the countries in the Northern Triangle all have many places with low homicidal violence. And for example, Honduras has more than 50 territories with very low homicidal violence. So it's clear that in order to understand the dynamics of the violence in the region, we have to delve into the subnational level. And it's also interesting the contrast. Costa Rica and Panama, which are normally seen as Pacific countries, show many municipalities with rates above 10. So again, in these countries, we can't think of them as Pacific countries. We have many regions that experience very high homicidal violence. And to see a little better this information, I mapped it. This map shows pretty much the same information, but now with the spatial variable. And again, the red colors show places with rates above 10 per 100,000 inhabitants, and the blue color shows all the municipalities with rates below 10. We could speak a lot about this map, but I just want to point out some key patterns. First, we see that in the Atlantic coast of Costa Rica, Panama, and Honduras, there are a tendency to have very high homicidal violence, even for these countries. And it's very interesting, for example, also that in the northwest of Guatemala, we see a big region of low homicidal violence, and I will discuss this a little later. And although this map is very useful, it has two main limitations. First, I'm just showing you 1 year, and as I explained before, the idea was to study the evolution of the violence through many years. And the other limitation, and probably the more important one, is that in order to see patterns here, we just have to see them by yourself. And our idea was to use a more formal approach in order to objectively define these patterns and identify them. So in order to do this, we conducted a spatial cluster analysis. I don't want to delve too deep into this, but I do want to point out some facts so that we can understand it a little better. There are many, no, not many, but there are some techniques or many different tools to do this kind of cluster analysis. We use the so-called local Moran's eye, which has been used before for this kind of data. And what this technique does, it helps us identify if the municipalities or the territories with similar levels of violence tend to cluster together in the territories. And so it analyzes the homicidal rates levels of each territory and of its surrounding territories. And if the evidence is sufficient to say that it's different from randomness, it identifies it as significant and classifies it into these 5 different categories. I'm just going to explain them very quickly. The high category stays for places that have high homicidal violence that are ringed by places of also very high homicidal violence. The high-low category, the light red, signals places of high homicidal violence that are surrounded by places of low homicidal violence. Then the dark blue territories, the low, signal places of low homicidal violence surrounded by places of also low homicidal violence. And finally, the low-high category are places of low violence but that are ringed by places with high homicide rates. And finally, there are many non-significant territories, just territories that aren't clustered in any way, just stay in so-called randomness. So to better see this, I'm going to delve into the maps right away. Here we see the map of Guatemala, and we see 2 maps, one from 2010 and one from 2017. The first thing that we can clearly see, and that is very distinguishable for the case of Guatemala, is that the clusters stay pretty much the same through the time. Here, the time lapse has been 8 years, And as we can see, both the clusters of low violence as the clusters of high violence have pretty much stayed the same. Specifically, we see a cluster of low violence at the northwest of Guatemala, as I explained before. This is a very big cluster that has gotten even bigger. And in contrast to these territories, we see a cluster of high violence in the south, and especially in the east of the country, in the border with Honduras. We asked in our interviews about some factors associated with these two clusters, and it was very important that they stated, not only in Guatemala, in other countries the same, that this low cluster violence are normally in places with a high proportion of indigenous population, places that are very rural, places that have a tendency to build small communities with very tight social cohesion. And they are even poor places. So this is very interesting because this contrasts with what some of the literature on this topic says. And if we compare this to the case of Honduras, we see a little difference in the fact that Honduras shows less stability over time. But we do see some trends, and specifically, we see some clusters of high violence in the west of the country, again in the border with Guatemala. So this is consistent with what we saw in the previous map. And we also see a cluster of low violence at the south that has stayed a little through time. And in the interviews of Honduras, again, we asked some possible explanations, and aside from what I already said of the territories of low violence, in Honduras, people emphasized in the fact that this violence in the border is associated with places that are strategically for organized crime and gangs. So this pretty much says again what we have already discovered in other research related to this topic. And the other map is the one from El Salvador. And here we see a totally different situation. Specifically, we see that there's no stability at all. For example, in 2010, we saw a cluster of high violence in San Salvador. That's like in the center of the country. And this cluster totally disappeared. And this happens the same with all other clusters. And if I had to show you other maps of other years, they would look totally different from these two. So the situation in El Salvador is totally different from the rest of the region. And this has to do with the fact that El Salvador has very small municipalities with a small population, but also to the fact that the criminal groups of El Salvador have gotten very good in moving around the territory. The interviewees emphasize that they, for example, have very easy ways to move to rural areas, which is not always the case in other countries. So this is also a little atypical for the region. Very quick about Panama and Costa Rica. Panama repeats some of the trends that I already explained. For instance, in the west, we see a cluster of low violence that again is related to places with high proportions of indigenous populations. And in the center, in the most developed area of Panama, and probably the most developed area of the entire region, we see a cluster of very high violence that is in the center where the canal is. Finally, Costa Rica is the country where the spatial variables aren't as important as they are in other countries. This is why we see less amount of clusters. But again, we see some trends that we saw before, specifically some places of high violence that have emerged recently in the coasts of the country and also in the borders. The study covers other topics and using similar data, but since my time is limited, I wanted to delve a little deeper in some of the policy recommendations that we make. And specifically, I wanted to discuss one, and that is the need of broadening the quality of the statistical information. Of course, as we already know, better data means better policies, and policies that will be more effective because they're based on the reality, actually. But here I wanted to go a little deeper, and because in the interviews, we found out that the NGOs, the research centers, the experts, many activists tend to cast doubts on the official data and on the institutions that produce this data. And this is a very big problem because, as we know, the efficiency and the effectiveness of the policies in the security topics need to have a broad support of the societies where they're implemented. They need to have a lot of participation from the communities, from the civil society in general. And in Central America, this nowadays is very difficult. So if you want better data, we need better institutions, we need less corruption, and in general, we need better democracies. Otherwise, this will not lead to a real descent in homicide rates. And finally, just pointing out some other recommendations. We need to generate policies that are sustained in time. As we have seen, some of the violence has stayed in the same territories for many years, so this is a key issue. We need to deepen the territorial focus of the security strategies, and all this sums together in the need for promoting policies based on empirical information. So I want to stop here, and of course we can discuss more in depth later. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mario. Okay, we'll turn it now to Laura.
So while they're switching the PowerPoint, first of all, sorry for speaking in English. My Spanish is not as eloquent and as that of the other speakers, but I wanted to thank Cindy, Eric, and the Seattle Foundation for actually having me and for discussing this topic. I wasn't joking. So this project, my project on crime and violence prevention, nearly killed me. And I said that every time, this is going to be the first 400 pages report on prevention that's going to kill the author. And in part because you very quickly discover how not all homicides are created equal, not all prevention are created equal. The same policy in different contexts takes a different shape and it has a different consequence. And requires understanding that goes from brain development to governance to many other fields of economics. I'm as nerdy as they come. In a past life, I was teaching econometrics and proving theorems. And the next step was my boss thought, this is a topic doesn't have very solid evidence. Let's put Laura to do these. And one of the most difficult things that I was faced with was actually finding data that was not in a national level when I started my project. So the first, and it's not out of being polite or candid, but a big congratulations to the team for having been able to actually secure and actually process data at the subnational level. For El Salvador, it's been available only recently. We are still trying to actually, in one of my projects, to actually digitalize some of the previous time series data. For Honduras, they're available, but we all know, and you from the region know even better, the debate between the observatorios and the police data and the kind of the debate whether we translate homicide into desaparecidos or other manipulation of statistics. So I actually fully support the policy recommendation, but also give compliments to the team for having secure subnational level data. And this is not important just for nerdy like me or other researcher. I'm going to explain it, and I'm going to show a graphic that hopefully is going to convince you that is also important and critical, even more so for policy. The other contrast that I want to actually bring back a little bit, it's very easy, and again, when we run these regression and homicide are very easy statistics to say, oh, on homicide is an homicide in each country, so are very easy to run, whether within country or cross-country comparison. But it's important not to forget the underlying motivation and dynamics of violence. I think this was laid out for Honduras and Guatemala. The pattern of clustering very much reproduce or kind of mimic the strategic area. It's not that there are no maras, there are no gangs, but where we see violence peaking is exactly in those territories that are strategic for drug trafficking organization. So what is that? It's competing for territory. Think about it, a food truck at the corner of Pennsylvania Avenue, what they want to do? They want to arrive first because then they're going to sell more. Control of city, control of ports of entry, these apply also to Mexico, becomes strategic and important. The optimal strategy to transport drugs from point A to point B is the highway. It's not small routes. Why? You need to minimize the probability of getting caught by the police and by rivals. For instance, and I know that it's not Central America, but in the case of Mexico, if you control Chihuahua, you control 11 ports of entry to the US. It's not a case that all the last probably 10 years of competition of drug trafficking organizations around Chihuahua, and you see skyrocketing violence around this area. So there is, in a sense, that as actually was pointed out, Honduras and Guatemala, some of these patterns actually mimic this. Why the high variability in El Salvador? Counter to some narrative, El Salvador is not a strategic route for drug trafficking organization. The amount of drugs that actually transit through El Salvador is very limited. What is at play there? There is a complete violence driven by identity. So now my identity as MS-13 that is defined as my enemy, as fighting my enemy, K-18. So now you have people controlling for territory that is not very specific to, for lack of a better word, an economic motives, but it's very much an identity. So, and this is not to demonize gangs, but why this is happening? There is complete vacuum. There is a breach of social contract that happened and actually caused the civil war in El Salvador. The same breach was not, if you want to kind of repair, by the civil war. And now I landed, if you want to, the opportunity for gangs to actually replace these, government institution. That's another, I'm gonna come back to the myth afterwards, but that's another misconception. These gangs have very high level of social cohesion. It's not around traditional institution, government institution, but the cohesion, the level of identity and cohesion around their norms is actually extremely high. So again, that's where we need to be careful and say high social cohesion or high homicides, because the motive behind them are even more interesting than some of these patterns. I can discuss all the technical stuff afterwards, but again, I would encourage to build on this data, and this data set. Even look for data that is not necessarily the traditional socioeconomic, poverty, inequality, and other level indicator, but think about potentially police spending, public spending on prevention, even measure of prison population as well as gang presence. I think they're going to enrich this narrative. And while I actually commend for getting a lot of information from the qualitative part of the study, I think these are data would really kind of even be critical for policy making. So it shows a slightly different than what I plotted, but so crime and violence is geographically clustered, and we see it. Granted, there are some exceptions, but in general, you see this level of clustering that is reproduced not only in Central America, not only in developing country, but also in our city. You have, in general, this is systematic. That is not even the municipality data that we need. It's the street level data. You have 15 to 25% of street segment in city that explain all between 60 to 75% of crimes. So, and this applies to Guatemala, in the case of Guatemala City, Antioquia, Medellin, Mexico, Seattle, Tel Aviv, and Minneapolis. So these are, and again, this is one of those stylized facts that every criminologist or every data person say, oh, it's not going to be the case. And then you can see it's confirmed across the different level of development, different contexts. In Brazil, you have the 2% of the municipality account for 50% of homicides. In El Salvador, you have the 10 municipality, 3.8% of municipality in El Salvador account between, if you look at the time series, between 30 and 40%. That means if you are able to actually, 30, 40% of homicides, if you are able to target your policy at a specific municipality and within critical street segment, you can really knock down some of this violence. And then you have 25 municipality account, roughly 9.5% of municipality account between 67 to 50%. So this level of concentration makes, well, that's easy. We know where it is. We know where are these people. Why don't we fix it? And again, some of these underlying motives for violence, some of these lack of trust in institutions, lack of governments, and in contrast, parallel institution building, create this kind of breach of governments or social contract that is very difficult to repair just with some policy. And sometimes some of the policing that is not accompanied by human rights, some can be, extrajudicial killing or imprisonment, can actually further divide the breach in social contract. Crime and violence is not just cluster, it's also proximal. This is one of the things, again, you have most of the crime happen at home in your own neighbors. So the homicides is not like me going to do a killing in another city, but I generally are very close in distance. And they're also persistent contagious. We find actually slightly harder persistency over time. Essentially, an additional homicide in the current year predicts 0.68 homicide the next year. And we find, for instance, the case of Mexico, that actually, if an homicide occurs in this municipality, predicts 0.6 homicide in all the surrounding municipality. However, crime and violence, and this is something that Guillermo didn't get to talk, is also clustered in many other dimensions, one of which is gender. This is one of the things, generally, the ratio between male to female homicide is actually between 7 and 12. So male are 7 to 12 times more likely to be victim of homicide. Again, this is where the motives of the homicide matters. Sometimes some of these statistics emerge. Just think about domestic violence. The homicide is the ultimate act of domestic violence. There is no violence for that person after the homicide, so there is a build-up. So it doesn't mean that women are not victims of violence, but again, unfortunately emerges as a statistic when it's too late. But the other things I want to point out here, and these are by design put on the same scale, one, the top panel is the age crime profile for the OLAC. And it's not enough to say, oh, most of the homicide happen between age 15 to 40. Why is not enough? Because that's where most of the population is, and because homicides are proportional to the population in that group, that's where most of homicides happen. But the red line is the one you care about. That is an estimated age crime profile. That means the abstract from the number of people in that specific age group, and it's telling you that pretty much it's pretty flat until 14. And even in LAC, where the homicide rate, what is for the average homicide rate is 20 or 23, fluctuating per 100,000. When you look at male, age 20 to 24, is 87 per 100,000. So even those, and again, this is another dimension of clustering that kind of mask the average mask. But if you look at El Salvador, again, I didn't have all the data for Central America, so I could not recreate it, but looking for El Salvador is 162 per 100,000. So again, and this is not specific. So this age crime profile as the clustering at the geographical level is another of those systematic, magical, I guess, empirical correlation. If you plot this for the US and for African American, in fact, there are homicide rates in 91 per 100,000 in the US. So it's not that we are comparing, now we are not comparing, oh, you can say, why we are talking about policies in the US? Prevention policy or like policing policy in the US, our level of violence is so different. If you look at the right population and the right neighborhoods, Chicago or even some places here in DC, the average are not that different. And then I want to close these with a little bit of debunking some myths, I think that we say or we read or some people say. And again, the first one is this notion of social cohesion. The social cohesion is always good. Social cohesion is good around the right set of institution. When you go in Brazil, I did work in Brazil, I did work in Mexico, there is extremely high social cohesion in municipality where there is a government vacuum, except that social cohesion is around parallel institution. Governance also can contribute to actually perpetration of violence, whether I don't report the crime, or police may be part of the problem sometimes. We run is as close as possible to a causal analysis, and we see the police officer, just the fact that a police officer, a person reporting, the police officer asked for bribes, not killed anybody. that increased the probability of victimization to 50%. So that is telling you the power, and we can have a much bigger discussion, I think Eric is gonna touch on this, on policing, about the importance in the institution. Legitimacy of institution, it also becomes part of the problem. This was actually touched at the beginning by Arturo on the notion of governance. The other things is like, oh, people, and the last 2 points come from data from a study I'm doing in Honduras, in 3 of the most violent municipalities in Honduras. It's a randomized controlled trial. We just finished, well, last year we finished a baseline. We are finishing a baseline report. We are gonna go in the field again. But these are some of the statistics that we gather. We got a bunch of data from youth in the field. And we ask about their aspiration. We ask about their jobs. We ask them about their family background. We ask them actually whether they perpetrate crime or they did crime or they were victim of crime. We ask them about soft skills. We ask about mental health and a bunch of other traditional socioeconomic indicators. Turns out all these youth have extremely high aspirations. Some of them are even dropout, both in terms of actually what they're gonna do in the future or their expectation of how happy they're gonna be in the future. Most of them are frustrated by lack of opportunity, lack of finance. Some even mention, and this is very resonant if we have a discussion similar to this in El Salvador, discrimination by the private sector. If I wear a tattoo or provided if I'm allowed to leave the gang, but once I suppose I become a calmado, I'm allowed to leave the gang, nobody's gonna hire me. Why? Because you're coming from that neighbors or you have that tattoo. And so there is also an obstacle. They're actually entrenched in how some of these places work. There is an immediate lack of opportunity. We also ask, would you like to move? And so permanently to a country, and so where? And we have a 52% of our samples say, yes, we would like to move permanently. But don't think these as, oh, they're completely irrational. These are people that have a high aspiration, and they would like to move. Why? And from an economic, and sorry to be as cut and dry, but this is a good investment. If they feel like I have a high aspiration and that they're not met, the best, most important, in fact, immigration in less political context is actually an investment in meeting those opportunities, realizing those opportunities. The other part is, so these youth in are idle ends or criminal are idle ends, means they're doing anything. The word on mean is almost done. It's not true. Criminal activity and low quality job coexist. So not all jobs are created equal in terms of prevention. So high quality jobs, but often are missing. The last one I wanna highlight is the mental health. So these was numbers that are clearly underestimate. We have 56% of youth report having a traumatic event, and this is not a small traumatic event. We are talking about death, threats, serious injury, or sexual violence. So clearly they're underreporting because they're not gonna tell us exactly what happened. 43% of all youth in my sample have PTSD or borderline PTSD comparable to Iraq Veterans War, or they have depression. So now you tell me, you know, these are youth that should be in school or they should be holding a job. They're hyper-reactive. They're in a context with violence. You know, if I feel threatened, my first response, optimal response, might be actually overreacting. But also it's clear that I cannot just offer traditional job. I cannot just tell them, give an incentive to stay in school. There is another dimension of the cost of violence that is the physical mental health dimension that we not often talk. And even if these people are participating in crime, they still have this dimension that need to be addressed. So that makes all this prevention discussion even more difficult. I went over time, sorry.
No, thank you. Thank you, Laura. Thank you. No, thank you. All right, let's conclude with Eric from Creative Associates International, and you've worked with both of the banks, right? IDB and World Bank. Yeah, so thank you, and we'll have time for questions. So be thinking about what you wanna raise. Go ahead.
Voy a hablar en español. Buenos días, gracias al Wilson Center y a Eric por la invitación. La verdad es que después de la presentación de Mario y los comentarios de Laura, ustedes saben aquel juego de los barquitos que dicen F4, tocado y hundido, pues estoy igual. Porque ella, o sea, anticipando que ella iba a ir muy en detalle con los comentarios, voy a hacer como un poco de zoom out y hacer un poco desde un nivel más macro. y hablar un poco de la evolución de los homicidios en la región, la mejora de los datos, etcétera, etcétera. Pero ante todo, felicitar a Mario por el estudio. Sí que es verdad que creo que es uno de los primeros estudios en la región que ha podido hacer un análisis tan detallado a nivel municipal, sobre todo análisis espacial, que un poco confirma pues esa evolución temporal de los homicidios, los patrones de aglomeración, etcétera, etcétera. Creo que todavía en la región se sigue utilizando el homicidio porque realmente es la única variable que permite hacer esa comparación a lo largo del tiempo entre comunidades, entre países y regiones, a pesar de los caveats, creo que son salvedades en castellano, que ha mencionado Laura. Asimismo, también la hemos utilizado un poco como un termómetro, un barómetro para medir cómo está la seguridad en la región, es decir, si ha aumentado mucho los homicidios, igual las políticas de seguridad no han ido tan bien, y si hay una reducción, pues a lo mejor las políticas de seguridad han ido reduciendo. Entonces también para nosotros, a pesar de que el homicidio, y esto a lo mejor puede sonar un poco contencioso comparado con otros delitos que están subreportados, sigue siendo un fenómeno raro, un fenómeno extremo, a pesar de que hay mucho en la región, lo utilizamos como ese termómetro para medir cómo estamos. A pesar de esas limitaciones, sí que es verdad que ha habido una mejora muy grande en la recolección de datos y en la calidad de los mismos. Hoy en día es posible encontrar datos en muchos países de Centroamérica a nivel municipal, y se podría argumentar que en mayor o menor medida la data es fidedigna. De hecho, un estudio, la Organización de las Naciones Unidas para las Drogas y el Crimen, en su informe no anual o bianual, pero sobre el estado de los homicidios, para el cual trabajé un poco, estaban haciendo análisis de correlación, y hoy en día, por ejemplo, la correlación que existe entre los datos recolectados por la policía y aquellos datos que están recolectados por el sistema de salud pública o medicina forense tiene una correlación moderadamente alta. Es decir, que hoy en día puedes utilizar datos o de la policía o de salud pública que más o menos podrás tener como una granularidad que es bastante fidedigna, ¿no? Todo y eso, a pesar de que queda mucho por hacer, a mí me gusta ver el vaso medio lleno, y creo que ha habido mucho avance. Este análisis no se podía haber hecho del 2000 al 2010, por ejemplo, pero la evolución en la última década nos permite hacer este tipo de estudios. Esta riqueza, entre comillas, en los datos también ha llevado a evolucionar el análisis sobre homicidios, y este es un ejemplo claro de ellos. Lo que confirma el estudio, que ya lo ha mencionado Mario, lo ha mencionado Laura, es que y esto se ha confirmado también aquí en Estados Unidos, y es que sí, que el homicidio en particular tiende a estar agregado, a concentrarse geográficamente y en un grupo reducido de personas en alto riesgo. Sí que es verdad que en la región de Centroamérica la gran mayoría de los homicidios probablemente estén influenciadas por el narcotráfico, como bien ha mencionado Laura, y creo que también es una de las limitaciones del estudio. Lo estábamos hablando con Mario antes del evento, pues que hubiera sido interesante ver cuál porcentaje de estos homicidios, que probablemente se deben a luchas territoriales, se debe al crimen organizado, ¿no? Pero yo creo que de aquí en adelante, cuando vayan evolucionando el estudio, puedan conseguir más datos, o por lo menos aproximarlo, pues serán capaces también de añadir más calidad a este análisis. Asimismo, también el avance en la granularidad y en la calidad de estos datos tiene implicaciones a nivel programático, también a nivel de políticas, ¿no? Si sabemos, por ejemplo, dónde se concentran geográficamente los homicidios y quiénes son aquellos individuos o grupos de individuos que cometen los homicidios o que están en alto riesgo, se podrán aplicar o por lo menos diseñar e implementar intervenciones que sean focalizadas para contener, reducir y, hopefully, prevenir esta plaga, ¿no? Por ejemplo, el aspecto de contención y reducción, que le compete más a la policía y al sistema de justicia criminal, podría utilizar programas, por ejemplo, que han mostrado algún efecto moderado en la reducción de los homicidios, como la disuasión focalizada, el focus deterrence. La prevención al mismo tiempo es igualmente importante. De hecho, no solo tiene implicaciones a largo plazo, de hecho, el estudio de 400 páginas que casi mata a Laura, ella mostró que realmente la prevención es a largo plazo. Y al mismo tiempo, la predicción también está relacionada con la reducción de los factores de riesgo. De hecho, el trabajo que está haciendo Lera en Honduras, que nosotros también en CRIEF estamos haciendo trabajos en la prevención de factores de riesgo entre jóvenes, nuestra evaluación de impacto está mostrando que realmente las acciones focalizadas en la reducción de factores de riesgo entre jóvenes y con las familias a través de las consejerías de familia han mostrado una reducción de la propensión a comportamientos de riesgo en estos jóvenes. La pregunta es, bueno, esa sostenibilidad, o sea, cuando se termina el programa, ¿a quién le compete? Yo creo que los gobiernos tendrían que incorporar o por lo menos adoptar este tipo de intervenciones o recoger sus datos para poder ser más efectivos en la prevención de la violencia. Asimismo, creo yo que previniendo o intentando prevenir los homicidios también estaríamos incidiendo en una serie de delitos violentos que normalmente preceden a los homicidios, que ya pueden ser el robo o el asalto o la agresión sexual misma, ¿no? Entonces, tanto la parte de contención y reducción como la prevención pueden mejorar gracias a este estudio. Yo, desde el punto de vista también mi gorra académica, me interesa mucho todo el tema de la mejora del desempeño de las instituciones. Y la habilidad de poder focalizar en zonas donde está la violencia concentrada geográficamente y al mismo tiempo sobre grupos de alto riesgo también puede tener un impacto sobre la eficiencia del gasto. Laura lo estaba mencionando anteriormente, de hacer un análisis de gasto público. Sí que es verdad que en la región, en la última década, en los últimos 15 años, se ha gastado cantidades ingentes de presupuesto público para mejorar los cuerpos de seguridad y uno pues podría argumentar que los resultados han sido moderados. Sí que ha habido reducciones en los homicidios, no sabemos si ha sido como resultado de las acciones policiales o otros impactos, pero sí que ese enfoque focalizado ayudaría a mejorar la eficiencia. En mi propio trabajo sobre la eficiencia policial en la región sí que he encontrado que, sobre todo en Centroamérica, comparado con el resto de países, y a mí no me gusta mucho comparar, sobre todo en temas policiales, porque están estructurados de forma diferente, los problemas son distintos, pero sí que la región centroamericana, sobre todo las organizaciones policiales, relativamente al resto de la región, tienen mucho a mejorar en términos de eficiencia, y esto yo creo que este tipo de intervención más focalizada les ayudaría. Y para terminar, porque no quiero recibir las tarjetitas de Eric, que me estresan, quería también mencionar algunas salvedades. Y eso también viene un poco de mi experiencia trabajando en estos temas en la región y si no están de acuerdo lo podemos discutir después. Y uno es que, a pesar de los avances es importante continuar haciendo esfuerzos para entender qué es lo que está pasando y al mismo tiempo fortalecer lo local. Yo creo que no se puede caer en el error del isomorfismo institucional. Creo que suena un poco técnica, pero me explico. El isomorfismo ocurre cuando organizaciones o instituciones adoptan ciertos modelos, ya sean para legitimarse o para obtener recursos o simplemente porque existe la creencia de que un modelo funciona en un sitio y tú lo tienes que aplicar aquí como tal. Os pongo un ejemplo. Por ejemplo, el tema de la disuasión focalizada, que parece ser que en Estados Unidos ha tenido un muy gran impacto, pero exige una coordinación entre policía, sector social, el sistema de justicia criminal. Entonces, imagínense un país donde la policía, ya para empezar, a nivel organizacional es casi una pirámide inversa. Entonces, no tienes policías a nivel de comunidad que puedan tener la discreción o que puedan identificar los problemas que existen. Un sistema de justicia criminal que todos sabemos que es lento, es ineficiente. Yo no sé cuál es la media en la región, pero en la resolución de homicidios, yo sé que en México creo que está alrededor de un 5 o un 7%. Es decir, un sistema de justicia que no puede caer con todo el peso en la ley para este programa específico. Al mismo tiempo, no existe la legitimidad de las organizaciones policiales en las comunidades. Hay poca confianza en la policía. Entonces, si a mí me ven con un programa así y soy incapaz de ver si tengo la capacidad, ya sea de recursos humanos, recursos financieros, cómo puedo estar organizado yo, probablemente tenga muy poco efecto a la hora de reducir los homicidios, utilizando, por ejemplo, este tipo de intervención como la disuasión focalizada. Eso no quiere decir que no se pueda adaptar, pero yo creo que es importante que hagamos un esfuerzo de intentar comprender cuál es la capacidad existente, porque si no, se están dirigiendo recursos humanos y financieros para este tipo de intervención y estamos, en cierta manera, la organización policial estaría dando un paso atrás en vez de intentar focalizarse en lo que ellos pueden hacer bien. Aquellas instituciones en aquellos países, por ejemplo, donde adapta o se adaptan o evolucionan de forma natural, el hecho de imitar ciertas intervenciones no sería ningún problema, pero yo creo que en la región centroamericana en particular, donde existe todavía mejorar o fortalecer la capacidad institucional, sí que podría ser un problema. Y finalmente también tuve como una realización, algo que me abrió mucho los ojos. La semana pasada tuve la oportunidad de participar en el National Network for Community Safety en Nueva York, una conferencia que hacen, que creo, anualmente. Celebraron el 10º aniversario. Y haciendo resumen de todo el trabajo que han hecho, me quedé un poco sorprendido porque decían, sabemos que lo que funciona, aparte de todo esto, el tema de la agregación geográfica, de los grupos en riesgo, etcétera, estaban hablando, sabemos que el trabajo a nivel comunitario funciona, que todo el tema de street outreach funciona, que el tema de la lideranza comunitaria funciona. Yo pensé, wow, hace 25 años, Rodrigo Guerrero, que fue como uno de los padres del tema de la prevención de la violencia cuando era alcalde de Cali, decía que él combatía la violencia con acupuntura, es decir, de forma focalizada geográficamente, a grupos en riesgo, coordinando con actores sociales, con la policía, y 25 años después se está mencionando todavía de que es esto lo que funciona. Entonces la pregunta es, bueno, ¿cómo podemos nosotros fortalecer algo que hace 25 años ya se sabía que funcionaba en un contexto de alta violencia como el de Cali? Con esto termino. Muchas gracias.
All right, thank you very much. I just wanted to make three observations based on these presentations. In some ways, and call me an optimist, there's some good news here, right? There's data that allows us to better understand this phenomenon, and congratulations to Mario and Estado de la Región to get some of that data out there. Now, there's always improvements that are needed. As you mentioned, Nicaragua doesn't have any data, so that's a problem. We can improve it. But the good news is we can really, in Central America, start to understand this a little more clearly. We also know that there's great concentration of homicides, both geographically, and the interesting part is here at the borders and port cities, which are also borders. I think that's really important. I would just push back a little bit. I wouldn't look at that as only a drug trafficking problem. It's, illicit networks dealing in illicit economies, so it could be other things, minerals, smuggling of people. But the point is still the same, that those border areas are really, really important. And they're also concentrated demographically, right? The stunning data around young men, I think, is, startling. And how it's focused amongst young women, too, in different parts and in different ways. So concentration. And then the third thing is that there are public policies that can be designed, that can be useful, can be helpful. But, and here's the but, we need governance. The institutions have to be willing to take that information and translate it into good public policies. But we know from other data, from Lera's work and other places, that prevention works, certain kinds of prevention work, certain law enforcement strategies work, but the governments themselves have to be willing to adopt this information and put it into practice. So that's the challenges we're faced with, and I thank you all for your participation and role in that. Let me open it up for questions from the audience. We have about 15 minutes, so if you wouldn't mind keeping your questions brief, we'll try to get 2 rounds in. I'll take 3 questions. Everybody's either stunned or still thinking.
It's morning.
It's morning. Oh, yes, I'm sorry. Our friend from the State Department. Yeah. Can you identify yourself?
Sure. Hi, I'm Jim Hamilton. I'm working at the State Department on Central American issues. And I just was curious if you thought a factor model analysis would be useful and productive in trying to identify root causes. So it looks like you did surveys to try to develop more information, and a lot of focus on geography and mentioning even very small street level regions are very important. But what about looking at things like economic, like income levels, or you mentioned that if police officers take bribes in an area, that would be an indicator, or if an area next to an area had a murder. But what about just a general factor model that we could look at and say, oh, these are the key drivers? Because it's hard to see like which factors have the highest weights, for instance, right now.
Okay, thanks. We'll take a question here from Cindy. Right here.
Thanks. Sure, Cindy Arnson from the Wilson Center. Eric, I was struck by your comment referencing Rodrigo Guerrero, the former mayor of Cali, who, as a physician, was the one who treated violence in the same way you would an epidemic, by looking for the places where it had the greatest incidence. Thinking of those 25 years, yes, data has gotten better, but has the ability to identify these hotspots in general improved the response of officials? Eric mentioned the question of the issue of governance. I mean, has there been a noticeable improvement in the responses of police and municipal authorities to take that information and make a difference?
One more question in this round. There's one right here, and we'll try to do a second one in a minute.
Gracias. Jeremy Young, soy periodista con El Jazeera. Me interesa que hablamos de homicidios, pero no hablamos de armas y balas y acceso a armas y balas en los países. ¿Ustedes pueden hablar un poco sobre este tema de si vienen legalmente o ilegalmente de Estados Unidos o si hay demasiado armas en los países para hacer algo? Si pueden hablar un poco de este tema, sería bueno. Gracias.
Thank you, Jeremy. Mario?
Well, thank you for the questions. First, regarding the possibility of making more specific models involving socioeconomic variables, the main issue here is that the Central American countries do make good service or very good service on socioeconomic variables, but the problem is that they don't have the information for the subnational level. Sometimes they do have some information, but that's mostly at the departments of the provincias level, but not to the municipal level. And also the victimization service that we use a lot to study criminal activities also don't have the necessary disaggregation. So this is the main obstacle here. Of course, there are ways to design and to get data in creative ways, and also data that are proxies to variables that are from our interest. And we are trying to identify this data, but it's not easy and requires lots of creativity. And hopefully we are finding some of this data. Just as an example, we wanted to explore the data on streets and highways and means of communication to get a proxy of some of the variables that we have spoken. Other data that we are trying to find is data related to forest and satellite images that may help identify some proxies to variables related to socioeconomic factors. Then related to about the weapons, sobre el tema de armas. Nosotros hicimos una exploración muy rápida de este tema y sí identificamos algunas tendencias interesantes que pueden funcionar para generar hipótesis. En la mayoría de países, con la única excepción de El Salvador y Costa Rica, se ha reducido la proporción de homicidios que son cometidos con armas, y también se ha reducido la cantidad de homicidios en general, ¿verdad? Entonces, digamos, se podría generar la hipótesis de que la mayoría de homicidios relacionados con el crimen organizado son los que se cometen con armas, ¿verdad? Y entonces ahí lo interesante es darnos cuenta que probablemente la efectividad de las políticas se haya enfocado sobre todo en temas de narcotráfico. Probablemente, y por algunos datos que tenemos, tipos de violencia como la violencia de género, violencia doméstica, no estén tan relacionados con armas de fuego, sino con otros tipos de armas u otros tipos de violencia. Pero estos datos son preliminares porque son a nivel nacional. Lamentablemente no podemos acceder a información a nivel subnacional sobre armas.
Okay. Laura, do you want to?
So I was the delinquent one going over my time, so I'm going to try to be brief. On the determinants, so clearly we could not do these at the municipal level, there are missing data. In the case of El Salvador, we're trying to correlate the homicide with actually GDP using street satellite level data. But for the region as a whole, we did this both in terms of dynamic panel data. We include poverty, GDP per capita, so then growth, institutional variable, extreme marker for poverty and unemployment. So to give you the brief, like a 2 minutes version, unemployment is, as I was mentioning, is not all created equal. Is unemployment for the youth, and it's low quality employment. So it's when you interact, if you want a youth entering the informal sector, one, they drop out of school, they immediately are on a lower trajectory, the quality of their peers stay low, and so then they are on this kind of low trajectory, quality trajectory path, and then they need to complement. Again, in Mexico, we had data on perpetrators. Throughout the life cycle, perpetrators are active in the labor market at higher rates than any of the general population. So there's very much a complementarity between the two. And also the other things, all the market, clearly institutional variable, lack of trust in the justice system, lack of trust in the policing are all specific determinants. And also we use as extreme marker for poverty, teenage pregnancy, that actually came out as a high predictor. It's not teenage pregnancies that predicts violence or, contraception, but it's very much a marker for early drop out of school and low poverty, low education, and lack of also health system in general. Hotspot and policing. So this is where I would be less cautious, and not because I'm just greedy for data. I think we just mentioned we have homicide data at the municipality level, but then we don't have social level, social indicator, for instance, at municipality level. If you wanted to operationalize hotspot, has to be available. Think about big data, has to be available, available to the police for deployment almost in real time. So the information system you need, you cannot stay at the municipality level. You need to go at the street segment level, and you need to identify even those individuals within those street segment. So at least there are some a movement. I think São Paulo has made important stride. Cali, because of traditional, has very good data. But what we are thinking is very much think about IBM Smarter City, focusing on crime. Chicago did it. It's possible to do it, but I don't think the concept and the culture of data for just-in-time policymaking is there. And the other things on the weapon, there is only one very, very good paper that I saw that look actually at changing in the U.S. law in assault ban weapon, and how that changed between, I think it was California, Arizona, and Texas, and how that impacted homicides in Mexico, and that established a very clear causal and actually credible from an academic point of view evidence. I would not cite it if it were not actually credible, and there is actually very significant spillover or legal arms the moment you relax those policy. The last point I wanted to make is on the politics of prevention. So we are still working in countries, and it's not just in countries. It's very difficult for a policymaker to run on a prevention strategy. Why? The narrative is going to build you're soft on crime, you don't care about the homicide, and the way that they report, and we try to actually reframe this, is in terms of cost effectiveness. Not because I don't care about people that die, because the policymaker has to be faced. It's like, what is more cost effective? How do you more effectively prevent the maximum amount of homicides or violence with the minimum amount of cost? And that's how you need to, it's important to change the policy and discussion around prevention that doesn't become soft versus hard, but it's like, what is cost effective? And so all this data or this evidence and causal evidence is critical to reframe these either or.
Okay. Eric?
Yeah, so I'm going to address Cynthia's question, but I'm echoing Laura's last comment. There's always this trade-off between politics and policy, right? And I think for I don't know how many years we've been struggling with this issue in the region, and I think this approach to cost effectiveness might be useful, but I put myself in the shoes of a politician, with high levels of violence. I wonder what my decisions would be, right? Because you need to actually show that you're actually tackling crime, but putting this cost effectiveness, if you can actually frame the message in a way that is convincing, might be useful. But on your question, I'm struck as you are. I think crime has changed a lot, or has evolved a lot in the region. And big municipalities that have resources, that have, you know, institutional capacity, they may have been able to have better data and respond better. But I think on average, you know, the answer, I don't know, but it would be a good study to do to see if, you know, in like mid-sized cities where violence is still very prevalent, whether, you know, governments have been able to actually to respond effectively, you know, focusing geographically on people and with balanced approaches, right? But, you know, it was sort of a realization to me that we're still talking about this as being effective after 25 years, right?
Great. We're almost out of time, so I'm going to take one question from the young one right here, and then we'll wrap it up.
Hi, my name is Sofia Abreu with the Inter-American Dialogue. My question is going off of Laura's point. So you mentioned that the youth have high aspirations in general, but that they still face barriers to social and economic inclusion. So what should governments do differently in order to like mitigate this? Or are there any like different policy suggestions?
Is the only question?
Yeah.
For me, should
Yeah.
I?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I'm gonna be complete delinquent and end up speaking more than the others. So I'm sorry. This is where we create, and that's why I say think about. You cannot just think about private, you know, the public, what the government can do, but also the private sector. So now thinking about gang desistance, support, and that's it alone. It's a very difficult process. Again, sometimes it's not even possible to leave a gang because again, define your identity, define even your work environment. But if you need to create a parallel opportunity, parallel life, one is jobs. But the problem is like now you have youth with a very high, you know, mental or low mental well-being that need to be remedied. Again, you cannot put somebody that has PTSD or depression and say, no, learn calculus or learn coding. It's the job of the future. It's not going to work. So now it's where there is this trade-off, a balance between where are your priority to make the investment, but at the same time without overwhelming the governance. Very often, and I think Eric can testify, we see what is called the Christmas tree operation or intervention where we do everything. We do gender prevention and then recovery public spaces and then jobs and then CBT and then education but the implementing unit is the same. Right. And so now you have a limited or lower capacity or lower resources that to be spread very thin. So this is where prioritization. I was working actually discussing how to do an evaluation of this program, and this is a pilot program, and I know they say, oh, this is done in New York, but this was like taking youth. So for the first 6 months or 3 months, I think you just do soft skill intervention. Think about grit, cognitive behavioral therapy, rethinking the thinking, rewiring some of the automatic behavior. After that, you teach the technical skill, but you continue reinforcing the, some of these soft skills. And then you partner, and this is in partner with IBM, so, and therefore that's why the linkages to the private sector is key, because then you need to offer a job. You cannot give the high skills to people that then are going to be discriminated, are not going to allow to work, or that job doesn't exist, or is a low quality job that then puts me back on the same low trajectory. So this is where if we wanted to make a difference, you need to find the right balance to think, again, long term, and where are the entry points that are kind of map a trajectory for success versus spreading yourself too thin. And again, this can be done sequentially, but this is one of the think about the roadblock every time you think about constraint, what constraint we are facing and when this constraint becomes binding. That's the process. I think it's important to review every time we do an intervention, and maybe, again, identify priority. Can we actually send kids back to school without doing anything on mental health? That probably becomes immediately a priority. Where is the dirty words that nobody talk about when you talk about CBT? How do we do this in low capacity setting? That's a completely different discussion, and I'm happy to talk.
By CBT, you mean cognitive behavioral
cognitive
therapy.
behavioral therapy. And again, we don't use when we work in the region the therapy, but it's think about rethinking the thinking. I pull out something black here, and you're going to think it's my iPhone. If we are in Southside Chicago or in a bad neighbors in Central America, you're going to think it's a gun. Now the optimal response, your optimal response is to shoot me. Why? Because you think I'm going to shoot you. So that means we are wired with automatic behavior. And automatic behavior are we all use it, and it's very positive. So if you open the door, you don't think, I'm opening the door, closing the door. So automatic behavior makes us efficient, but when you overlay automatic behavior from cue from the environment that are violent and potentially some additional hyperreactivity or condition to kind of identify overreact, then you have, especially during the teen years, and I didn't go into this, you have a kind of a mixed explosion of hyperreactivity reacting to the cue when instead it is a misunderstanding. Most of the homicides are not premeditated. So again, are actually escalation of violence and I don't want to reduce it to misunderstanding. The statistic from Chicago is 75 to 80% is actually an escalation of violence. I saw somebody with a gun, they took my bike, and people die over bikes. It's not that different in some of the streets where we're working in Honduras, where again, they feel triggered. This is another interesting part of our survey. Everybody consistently say violence is not the way to solve issues, but they say, if provoked, I'm gonna fight back. So this is, and where then you mistake that provocation cue, then becomes lethal in this context. And so again, this is a new way to rewire some of these biases and kind of improve great sociability and kind of other soft skill. Sorry.
All right, thank you very, very much. I don't know, Mario, do you have a last comment or you?
Yeah.
Make it brief.
Quick. Primero quería elaborar un poco sobre lo que Eric mencionó sobre que podemos ser optimistas. De hecho, desde que nosotros terminamos esta investigación, hemos continuado revisando los datos sobre el tema y es impresionante la cantidad tanto de publicaciones como de datos que han salido. Inicialmente nosotros tuvimos que perder mucho tiempo y mucho esfuerzo recopilando datos, haciendo minería de datos por todo lado. Hoy en día las herramientas disponibles en línea son mucho mejores. Y con el tema de la inclusión de jóvenes, es importante tomar en cuenta, y esto lo leí recientemente en un libro, que la criminalidad es inclusiva, por definición. Si usted está en un barrio violento, es muy fácil entrar a una organización criminal, sin importar de dónde venga usted, cómo se ve, qué sexo tiene, si tiene tatuajes. Lamentablemente nuestras sociedades no son inclusivas y muchas veces el sector privado y el sector público no lo son. Entonces va por ahí también. Hay que entender las motivaciones de por qué algunas personas en estos barrios terminan entrando a estas organizaciones.
Okay, as you can see, there's a lot here we get excited about, the geeks, right? Please look up on our website at the Wilson Center on the page that announces this event, the paper by Estado de la Región. Please look for Laura's article, booklet, I could call that, a book that almost took her life. Stop the Violence.
The 75 pages is the overview. There is a 400 pages.
Right. It's very, very fascinating stuff, so I'm excited about it. Anyway, what we're going to do is transition immediately into the next panel. I'll invite the speakers to come up. If you need a bathroom break, please do so. But we want to keep moving because we have a lot of things to cover today. Thank you very much, everybody.